Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome to an amazing Tuesday session. I'm wearing my bright orange shirt today in celebration of the fall. I told a friend here that you have to be in the right mood to wear a really bright orange. You just have to own it. And I'm really hoping today that I can do it because what I want to share today is a little bit last minute, but it deserves an orange shirt. So sometimes with the kinds of communications that we get here at Usuli, you really need a bit of humor, patience, and heart. And so I'm going to present 3 examples of where you need each of those. So this is the first one that I felt required a little bit of humor. You know, a lot of times when people write to the sheikh, they are, send a really lovely message that's really properly, respectful. They say, Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. I pray you're well. I know you're really busy and I'm sorry to trouble you. They usually say something nice. And they say, I have a question for you, and if you can get to it, I really appreciate it. And, it's just a very decent message, as you would expect. So here's one that we got this morning. Dear Sheikh, kindly answer me to your question. How much of the law changes based on circumstances? That's it. So, there's part of me that just wants to, get on and pretend to be Sheikh. So I figured the best way is just to answer it here, and that's just to say, how much of the law changes based on circumstances? A lot. Okay. So the second example that requires patience, I'm just going to put on my scarf if you don't mind. All right. Humor, yes, humor here too. Assalamu alaikum, sister. While Dr. Abul Fadl is a knowledgeable scholar, many Muslims are not taking Grace seriously because they believe that her knowledge is superficial, since she does not she's not modest in her personal attire. Now, I'm sure it's the orange, not the scarf. For many Muslims, this is important. Perhaps if you wear a scarf and have loose clothing, you may entice more people to watch your channel. Perception matters when you are trying to attract followers. I believe this is a reason why your channel has such a low number of subscribers and followers. One cannot be rigid and inflexible because of their belief that modest attire does not matter. Something to ponder about if you want your institute to grow and gain more followers and donations. Tradition and perception matters. She's not going to know the answer to my question, or to her question. We are not really necessarily looking for followers. We're looking for critical thinkers and people who are not afraid to challenge the status quo, use their God-given brain and intellect, and be able to listen to a woman whether she's wearing a scarf or not a scarf. So I've talked about this in other things, and I'm sorry to be sort of, maybe disrespectful in my response, but what we do here really does require some exertion of intellect, and it's not for everyone. And if I offend you because I don't wear a scarf, then maybe this channel is really not for you. So I hope that's not the case, because I think what we do here is extremely important. I think that people need to be reconnected to the Quran, and in order to do that, it requires hard work. It requires patience. It requires looking beyond the superficial and delving deep into what really matters. And so I invite you to join me in doing that, whether I wear a scarf or not. So anyway, but I think I shared a link. This was a comment on YouTube. So I shared a link there for a previous excerpt that we posted that addressed this very issue, because I do get this question a lot, like, why is she immodest? Why is she not wearing a scarf? All of this kind of thing. And it's a complicated issue. The Sheikh has talked about it, and I invite you to not just think of it superficially, but actually to delve into the evidence behind it and do some thinking and recognize that it's between a woman and her God. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Lastly, okay, so we did humor and patience, and heart. So the last one is This is the one, I got a really, really beautiful message from someone, and I struggled with whether or not I should talk about this here. And I think because I'm fortunate that I'm not a scholar, I have some leeway to just share an opinion. And this is from convert to someone who is considering conversion. So he wrote me a really nice message, first asking if this was a safe space to ask a question. This was a question that came through our website. And so I wrote him back and I said, yes, it absolutely is a safe space. One of the things that we are very clear about in our values, which we have posted on the website, is that there is no embarrassment in religion, and there is nothing more important than being able to question every aspect about your faith, because this is the most important thing that you should hold dear to your heart. And if something doesn't sit right with you, you have every single right to ask a question, and you should ask a question of someone who's knowledgeable, someone who's a scholar, who can answer that appropriately. And I'm proud of the fact that here in this space, we've touched upon a lot of very controversial topics, and we don't do it, superficially or, without a lot of, thought and background, or, evidence and tradition. So, I wrote him back. He said, thank you for your kind message. Oh, that's me. He said, I'm especially, he said, I'm very familiar with the Usuli content. I particularly love your videos on converts and your own experiences, which I found very moving and have turned to in times of doubt in my beliefs. I already spend a lot of time watching your channel, and I'm using the halakas for further guidance after I read each surah of the Quran. Let me take this time to thank you and the doctor for your incredible efforts in illustrating the profundity of the Quranic message, even as far away from people such as myself as you are. I believe I am on a path to one day accepting Islam in my heart, but as a person of conscience and having led, to the best of my ability, a morally conscious life up until now, there are things that I must reconcile with Islamic theology and teachings if I am to accept the faith. I hope this is not inappropriate to ask. As a person of faith and one who recognizes the beauty of the Islamic message as touching my soul on a primordial and natural level, how can I reconcile what the majority of Muslim thought espouses on the permissibility of homosexual relationships? As I said, I have lived until now a moral person, and I cannot, understanding natural phenomena as they are, comprehend how such relationships could be sinful. I have queer friends I love very much, and it hurts me to think they would attribute judgment on my part onto them because of a teaching within the faith I believed in. I don't expect a comprehensive answer, nor do I expect anyone to alter their beliefs just to quell the angst of a curious, if not simply naive person as I may be. But in any case, from everything you've said online, I've always felt as though I would have asked such questions in person to you all if I were not so far away. I suppose I just want to know if this is a normal question of conscience from someone wanting to come into the faith. Anytime you have to answer this is really appreciated. So, I'm not a scholar, obviously, I've said many times, and I cannot answer that question from a theological perspective, although the Sheikh has touched upon this issue in a number of excerpts and a number of videos. And so I would definitely recommend that you search those up and you look at that, look at those responses, which I think are really beautiful. It's obviously a very controversial topic and a very divisive topic. And I think really what I just wanted to say is to share my opinion from the heart, because obviously I have recently come to know more and more people who identify quite shamefully as homosexual. It's not something that they would necessarily say because they come from Muslim families, or they understand that this is something you just don't admit out in the open. And I think that some of these people are the most pure and beautiful souls I have ever met, and would put any Muslim to shame when I look at their beauty, their passion, their kindness, generosity, everything beautiful about what God has created in a person. And I feel honored to call some of these people my very dear friends. And so for me, everything that I know and have learned in these halakas, and everything that I've always believed in about my God, is that this is a God of love and mercy and kindness and generosity and fairness and beauty, and for all of the different qualities that I imagine in a beautiful person, I could not imagine that I could just turn to someone and say, you're homosexual and therefore you're evil and you're horrible and you can doom yourself to hell, and that this is not something that is allowed in our religion, and so therefore you should be doomed to a life of misery. God created you that way, and who knows why, and you should just suffer the rest of your life. That just is not consistent with what I know to be my God. I'm not a theologian. I don't know the answer. I don't know why. I can't answer anything, but I just know from my own heart that that's just not the God that I believe in. I understand this is a complicated issue left for people who can handle these kinds of issues, but for every queer person that I know, I don't know if even that's the right term, but every person that I know, it's not my business what their sexuality is. My business is what kind of a person that person is. Is that person moral? Is that person kind, beautiful? Am I proud to call them my friend? And if I am, I will love them with my whole heart and do everything that I can to support and love that person, whether they're Muslim or not. So, and I would not allow, and this is like, again, we know from this path that we're taking here that this is a lonely path. There are not a lot of people that really want to invest the time in grappling with difficult issues or studying. And so it's easy to judge, and it's easy to be mean, and it's easy to be dismissive. And I think that's wrong. So this path, is, I think that the only way to live your life is ethically and beautifully and morally and with love and with trust that God is ultimately just, and just to do your best. And again, that's just my own personal opinion. One convert to someone who I hope will convert, and I hope that the way that other Muslims react to this issue will not prevent you from delving into the most beautiful religion that exists and the most beautiful path to peace and love and beauty that I know. And the more we delve into these halakas and these chapters, it just underscores that and just makes my conviction that much more strong. So I don't know if that helps, but I just wanted to share that and and wear it or say it while I'm wearing my orange shirt, because with the orange shirt comes a little bit more bravery than normal. So anyway, and for whatever that's worth, I hope that you'll always think of this faith as the most elevated path to love and beauty, and there's no room for anything but that on this road. So anyway, inshallah, or whatever that's worth. And I'm so excited to continue with another amazing surah, number 63, right?
82.
Oh, no, I mean, that's the surah number. This is our 63rd surah, right? I know, Joe knows the number of every surah, the chapter number of every surah, but this is our 63rd that we've covered in Project Illumine, and yes, surah 83, surah Infitar. 82? 82, excuse me, okay.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحان الله العلي العظيم، الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على محمد المرسل رحمة للعالمين، خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين، وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. So inshallah today we do Surah Al-Infitar, and it's a short surah. A short surah, 19 verses, 19 ayahs. So inshallah it will be smooth sailing. Surah Al-Infitar, there are a number of reports that say that Surah Al-Infitar was revealed after Al-Nazi'at. And if so, Surah Al-Infitar would be, and in fact, after al-Nazi'at, before al-Inshiqaq. So if so, then Surah Al-Infitar would be among the last surahs revealed in Mecca. This would mean that it would be a surah revealed shortly before Surah Al-Rum, which we've talked about already, and Surah Al-Mutaffifin, which we have not talked about. But then it would place it after most of the surah that we've talked about. So it would place it, of course, after Al-Ma'raj, and it would place it after Surah Al-Ma'arij, it would place it after Al-Tur and Al-Sajda and Al-Mulk, and so on. Although we have these reports that say that it was revealed after al-Nazi'at and before al-Inshiqaq, for a variety of reasons, including reports of a general nature meaning that reports that say that Surah Al-Inshiqaq was a mid-Meccan revelation or an early Meccan revelation without specifying the order of revelation. So reports that just say it's mid-Meccan or early Meccan without specifying more than that. I might be wrong. I mean, it is quite possible that I'm entirely wrong about this, but my feeling is that it is not a late Meccan revelation. I have technical reasons for being a bit skeptical about the reports that say it was revealed after al-Nazi'at and before al-Inshiqaq. And part of the ambiguity about the time of revelation is that most of the reports, contextual reports about Surah Al-Inshiqaq, Surah Al-Infitar, actually are contextual revelations that occur long after the revelations. So most of the contextual revelations, in other words, reports that give us some context to this revelation, seem to occur in Medina, so well after the surah was revealed. And that, of course, then adds to the sense of ambiguity as to when precisely it was revealed. But with Surah Al-Infitar, maybe it doesn't really make a difference, because Surah Al-Infitar's message is fairly direct and fairly straightforward. Because it is so fundamental, and especially that Quranic theme as the theme of what can possibly make a human being misunderstand the relationship with their Lord, misunderstand the nature of this relationship, and which is the al-ghurur billah, or وَلَا يَغُرُّنَّكَ بِاللَّهِ الْغُرُورُ, that taking God for granted. It's so fundamental and so basic that it's difficult to imagine that it is a late Meccan revelation. Allahu A'lam, Allahu A'lam. But with Surah Al-Infitar, the best way to proceed pedagogically, I think, with this surah is to talk about the traditional meaning, the literal meaning, because it's fairly straightforward, and then some of the Sufi-esque orientations towards Surah Al-Infitar, and then my own take on Surah Al-Infitar. So we just do it in these three layers. Okay, so some of the reports that we have surrounding Surah Al-Infitar is in a lot of the reports center around the ayah number number 6. يا أيها الإنسان ما غرك بربك الكريم, which is a rhetorical question, a question that is designed to invite people to reflect. And the question, what Allah asks human beings, what could possibly have made you as human beings take God for granted to this extent? And so we get a number of reports about this. So some of the reports say that the Prophet ﷺ himself commented that the reason human beings take God for granted and take their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for granted is because of jahl, because of ignorance. Other reports say that Hassan al-Basri comments again in the same that the reason is your own demons, or the inner demons in human beings. There is a report attributed to Umar ibn al-Khattab that he responds or he comments on this, that it is human ignorance and humq or idiocy that make them take God for granted. There are reports attributed to Ali bin Abi Talib that he comments on this, which says it is Allah's kindness and patience with human beings that make human beings take God for granted. That because God allows them to get away with so much in their earthly life, then they think that that treatment will somehow get them off the hook in terms of accountability. So we have these reports that of various people, whether the Prophet ﷺ or one or other of the Sahaba, commenting about, in response to that key question, مَا غَرَّكَ بِرَبِّكَ الْكَرِيمِ, what could have possibly made you go astray because you took God for granted so much? There are other reports which would, the most famous of them is a report about Muaz bin Jabal, where Muaz prays Isha, and apparently he recites a very long surah in Isha, or at least that's what the report says, and Isha prayer takes a very long time, and then the Prophet ﷺ comments to Muaz أفتان أنت يا معاذ, meaning, do you, أفتان is, do you want to test people's faith? I mean, or do you seek to it's a way of idiomatically, it's a way of the Prophet ﷺ telling Muaz that he shouldn't have prayed for so long because that's too difficult for people. And then in some versions of these reports, then the Prophet ﷺ says, أين أنت من سورة الضحى, or سبح اسم ربك الأعلى, and in some versions he also mentions والسماء إذا انفطرت. So in other words, the Prophet is then telling Muaz, instead of reciting a long surah, and again we don't know what surah Muaz reportedly recited in Surah in Isha that made Isha's prayer so long, he tells him, why didn't you recite one of the shorter surah like Duha or Sabbih Isma Rabbika al-A'la or إذا السماء انفطرت? If this report is accurate, if this is an authentic report, there must have been some circumstances that we are not aware of, because we have other reports that sometimes the Prophet ﷺ would recite Surah Al-Kahf in its entirety, or one of the longer surah in one of the furud, in one of the either Maghrib or Isha. And so, when you read a report like this, and it's ahad, I mean, the chain is good, but it's not a cumulative report. You have to understand that it's not. You can't derive something of illegal ruling on its basis, because there are circumstances missing in a report like this. Why? What were the circumstances surrounding this Isha prayer? Were there, when did this Isha prayer take place in terms of, was it before a battle, after a battle? Were there wounded people? Were there a lot of children? In order to use a report to make any type of positive, to derive any type of positive ruling, circumstances surrounding a report need to be specific and clear. Otherwise, you can't confidently say, well, it is not proper to recite a longer surah in prayer. And rather, the conclusion would be is that circumstantially, you have to be compassionate when leading prayer. That, you have to keep the circumstances in mind so that you don't exhaust people and you don't overburden people. Okay, then we have other reports that talk about the ajr, all the hasanat that are earned from reading Surah Al-Infitar. And again, the thing about these reports is that they have the earmark of medieval narratives. So one of these reports, for instance, says that if you read Surah Al-Infitar, Allah rewards you hasanat equal to the number of drops in rainfall. Now, you can't take these reports literally, and you can't just take them and read them in a literal way, because we know that in medieval narratives, the way that this genre of saying something is good or bad was often to have this form of exaggeration. To say something is good, and so the reward is equal to all the gold in the world, or all the rain in the world, or equal to, and in reports like this, what you can derive from them is that the Prophet ﷺ probably did recommend to people to read Surah Al-Infitar frequently. But the way that people remembered that recommendation and preserved it, they did it within the forms of narrative that were familiar to them in their day and age. And so, and one of the things that strikes you immediately is that the reports, some of them say the reward is equal to a number of raindrops in the world, or some of them say equal to the amount of plants in the heavens, or some of them say that if you read Surah Al-Infitar, the sins of the day are forgiven. These, again, it's very dangerous to take these reports literally. And many of them, if you take them, there's clear tension between these forms of reports about the Ajr. As I said, you can conclude from them that it is highly recommended to read Surah Al-Infitar, but more important than reading Surah Al-Infitar, in my opinion, is to understand Surah Al-Infitar, to comprehend it and to internalize it. But that you can't then take any of these reports literally. Okay, so let's start out with the most straightforward method, and that's the traditional in interpreting Surah Al-Infitar. إذا السماء انفطرت, when the sky is cleft asunder or torn asunder. وإذا الكواكب انتثرت, and when the stars or planets are dispersed. وإذا البحار فجرت, when the seas are burst forth or the seas are burst. وإذا القبور بعثرت, and the graves turned inside out. In Infitar al-Sama, of course, we have the Quran in several places indicating the ripping apart of the heavens or the sky surrounding the earth, and specifically as in the final day or in Yawm al-Qiyamah. And sometimes, as we've talked about before, that there's even a description that the sky will become like open doors. There are hadiths that say that the angels would be descending from the skies. But what we can take from the Quranic narrative, and what all the traditional Quranic narratives point out to, is the skies, the atmosphere surrounding the earth will be destroyed. And that this accompanies the end of life as we know it on this earth. And one can imagine, with our modern knowledge, is that what the atmosphere that surrounds the Earth is already so fragile and so carefully structured that its undoing will be a very turbulent event and an event of extinction. You get a little bit more discussion about وَإِذَا الْكَوَاكِبُ انْتَثَرَتْ is God saying that in fact stars and planets that we see in the heavens, are they in fact going to be changing their position, falling out of the skies or being destroyed in some fashion? Or is it the perception, that our perception of these planets is what is going to change, so that it will appear to us that planets that we can see or stars that we can see will no longer be able to see, or the way that we see of course in our modern language we say the way that we see light reaching us from far away is going to change, because we know in fact that it is the travel of light from far distances. Interestingly, even in traditional tafsir, you get this discussion as to whether in fact it will be destruction beyond the earth, or simply the changes taking place on earth. And all we can say is that what we see in the heavens is what will be affected. There is a discussion, not very interesting in my view, about why Allah uses kawakib in this context instead of nujum. Kawakib means normally heavenly bodies, while nujum means stars. And you notice in Surah Infitar that Allah uses kawakib. Okay. وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ فُجِّرَتْ. So clearly there will be a turbulence in the seas. Most traditional tafsir say that two things will take place. One is the corrupting of fresh water, that there will be changes on earth. In our modern language we say gravitational changes, so severe that the processes that keep fresh water separate from salt water will degrade, and eventually the disappearance of water, the drying up of water on earth. Interestingly, in some of the traditional tafsir, they say, well, biharu fujirat, they read this as not the drying up of water, but of enormous, unprecedented floods taking place in at the end. Which is interesting considering what we know about where things are heading with floods and the like. Okay. And then وَإِذَا الْقُبُورُ بُعْثِرَتْ, literally graves turned inside out, an indication of that buried bodies will not remain in the same state, meaning the cracking of earth. Now, whether people are going to be emerging from their graves or not, as some scholars say that the graves will turn upside down and you'll find, people will be emerging out of their graves, or it is more a, if you will, what is the word I'm looking for? an image and merely a metaphor to refer to something, so that graves turned inside out, not necessarily that bodies or physical bodies are emerging out of the graves, but that the graves themselves, like much of the earth's crust, will be broken, and that image is not the literal emergence of bodies from graves, but rather the resurrection of human beings is what is intended. And you get an interesting discussion because, some scholars say God doesn't say literally that, or explicitly, that you will have something like bodies coming out of graves, but God always just refers to resurrection by pointing our attention that graves will not remain settled. Anyway, so that's a minor point, because it is the resurrection that is intended, whether, however form, and I don't think we have a frame of reference that can tell us how the resurrection that is intended will be. Okay. Now, there is a hadith, I don't think I noted it anyway, but there is a hadith attributed to the Prophet ﷺ where the Prophet refers to Surah At-Takwir and Surah Al-Infitar, and says, whoever wants to understand what will transpire in the final day, let them reflect on Surah Al-Takwir and Surah Al-Infitar. And it's among it's not it's not a hadith that you can build a theological point on, but it's reported, and technically, again, it has a correct isnad. But it is not backed up by other hadiths that would give us the ability to say that cumulatively that anything that we can derive theologically from it. But definitely in Surah Al-Takwir and Surah Al-Infitar is this description of the chaos and the disintegration of both the atmosphere and the ground in the hereafter, or in the final day. Okay, so this is then a clear, quick introduction, and followed quickly by علمت نفس ما قدمت وأخرت. On that day is the day that each soul will see clearly what it did forwards and backwards. Now, قدمت وأخرت could be, if it's used idiomatically throughout Arabic, to refer to everything you've done. Those who try to give it a more literal meaning, say something like قدمت means what it did in the past, وأخرت, what it did in the past, وقدمت, the consequences of its actions. But I think that the meaning is clear, that everything that this soul did. The Prophet ﷺ in the context of this ayah, and there are a number of versions, but this is widely reported. And the narration that is widely reported about the Prophet ﷺ in the context of this ayah is the narrations about Sunnah al-Hasana wa Sunnah al-Sayyi'ah. And most of these narrations say something to the effect of من استنى سنة حسنة فله أجرها وأجر من عمل بها إلى يوم القيامة, and so on. So, meaning that whoever does something, whoever follows your example, whatever action you've done, it acts as a precedent. And whoever follows your example for good until the hereafter, you get a reward from that. But whoever follows your example for bad, because of the precedent that you've set, and if it's a bad precedent, and people imitate that, then you will incur the sin from that until the hereafter as well. فعليه وزره ووزر من عمل بها إلى يوم القيامة, that you incur the sin of what you've done, and you incur the sin of those who learn from you. Now, of course, this clearly, and this is one of the reasons that makes me suspect that Surah Infitar was an early Meccan revelation. This understanding of the nature of sin and the nature of good deeds, that you are not just doing something good to just simply in response to a particular event, but you are actually doing something good in order to set a good example. And you want to set a good example because in your mind that whatever is going to follow from that good example until the end, you will reap the benefit of that. But at the same time, the concern about setting bad examples, including stinginess or failure to help other Muslims in need, especially during the persecution in Mecca, and then of course after the Hijrah, or even when running away in battle, or even losing a battle. I mean, it had become firmly embedded in the psyche of Muslims so early on that, well, one of the big problems with us not doing well and doing our job well is that we might be carrying the consequences of that failure or that misdeed to God knows when. And that's a terrifying idea, if you think of it. It's a terrifying idea. One of the reasons that you learn the art of privacy in Islam, in the West, sexuality is nearly something that's public. Because Grace was mentioning homosexuality. Your sexuality is no one's business. Is no one's business. Part of the reason it is no one's business is you do not want to be gambling with setting precedents on an issue like sexuality. there are things that should remain between you and God. And people should learn to respect your privacies. And this is also why, the real meaning of modesty is that you are not flouting things. But part of our understanding the very nature of privacy is thinking about, can I handle the consequences of setting a precedent, for better or for worse? So if you are absolutely sure that something is good, you'd say, well, no, I want to set that precedent. But if you're not sure, and there's a chance that you would be misunderstood because of your own carelessness, or because of your own negligence, or because of your own failure to express, or whatever, you can't just think of your responsibility, your immediate responsibility, but you have to think of the impact that you are leaving upon others and what message you are communicating. And that is a different approach to morality, by the way. Philosophically, that's a different way of approaching the question of virtue and ethics. And if you work the philosophical implications of that, it would lead you to very different results than ones that say, well, your accountability or your responsibility is limited solely by foreseeability. Whatever you can foresee specifically and concretely is maybe what you're responsible for, but beyond that, you bear no responsibility. That's a very different attitude towards virtue and ethics than one that says, you might be accountable for the precedent you set. If you set it out of malice, out of ignorance, out of negligence, even if the consequences were not necessarily foreseeable. Of course, we can't go through all the full explanation of how that actually is a huge philosophical difference. But it has an enormous impact in the way virtue is conceptualized and imagined and articulated. As far as we can tell, very early on in the Islamic community, from the very early Meccan reports and the reports about what people did early on in Mecca onwards. So if these ahadith were narrated, as so many of the tradition tells us, in the context of the Prophet ﷺ commenting on Surah Al-Infitar, then that would mean Surah Al-Infitar would have to be an early Meccan revelation. And we can't take the other reports that say it was after Nazi'at and before Al-Inshiqaq. We can't rely on these reports. Okay. So, after this question after the human beings will see clearly their actions and the consequences of their actions, ما قدمت وما أخرت. That then question that I said, we have various traditions about يا أيها الإنسان ما غرك بربك الكريم. The question that Allah poses human beings, why have you, and here غرك in this one, the study Quran says, what has deluded you with regard to your noble Lord? And غرك, deluded you, it could mean that cause you not to heed the commands of your Lord, not to believe in your Lord. But we have so many reports, and especially in traditional tafsir, that talk about that the ghurur intended here is relying on the idea that there will be, that you will escape accountability. And this, of course, is in just a few ayahs later, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ الدِّينِ ثُمَّ مَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا يَوْمُ الدِّينِ, this is, of course, 17 and 18. Remember that يَوْمُ الدِّينِ, in some qira'at, is يَوْمُ الدَّيْنِ. And deen or dain means the day where debts are settled. The word diyun, of debts, is derived from the same word, dain. And dain means debt. And so Yawmuddin or Yawmuddain is the day where debts are settled. So when Allah says, مَا غَرَّكَ بِرَبِّكَ الْكَرِيمِ, now in a lot of traditional tafsir, because it says مَا غَرَّكَ بِرَبِّكَ الْكَرِيمِ, and karam could mean nobility and generosity. And the answer that many Muslim theologians said is that precisely what deludes human being is Allah's generosity. So, and that's why Allah specifically says, رَبِّكَ الْكَرِيمِ, your generous Lord. Is that because in earthly life, Allah gives us so much and postpones our punishment, is that we start believing that somehow we are not going to be held to account for what we've done. Is that somehow we will get a pass. And of course, there is so much written about this that, it's just so much, that the tendency for human beings to, those who don't believe in God and deny accountability altogether, that's a different type of delusion. But so many of those who do believe in God, it is precisely the more they enjoy in earthly life, the more they are blessed in earthly life, the more God gives them in earthly life, the more it becomes the idea of being punished or being held to account it becomes more and more alien to them, as they simply presume that, well, God is most forgiving and most kind, and so surely God will just, will see that I am a nice human being and I'm not as bad as, so many other people in the world, and so I will be okay. And of course, only Allah knows who's worse than who. You might think that you're in the top 10% of nice people, and in fact you could be the bottom 10%, because Allah knows what's in your heart, and you could be much worse than you think you are. But other than that, even if you have the purest heart in the world, but if your deeds don't support and affirm what is in your heart, then in Islam, mere belief, unsupported by actions, doesn't amount to much. So this is not a salvational religion where simply acceptance of Jesus absolves you of your sins. Your actions have to testify and have to be a translation of your beliefs. But yet, subhanAllah, I mean, it is true. I mean, when I was younger, I used to think that Muslim theologians exaggerate this point about how many people think that God will just give them a pass at the end. But life experience has actually taught me that that is probably the number one reason that so many people who believe in God more or less, believe in the hereafter more or less, in fact, violate what God has said at so many levels. And they always believe that at the end they'll be okay. It is few people who will bluntly admit that they're probably going to be, that they, well, yeah, I know what I've done, I'm going to be punished for, and I'm fine with that. Most people say, well, you know, when it comes to it, I'll probably be okay, and God will forgive. Okay. Okay. So, what deluded you about your Kareem, your noble and generous Lord, الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك, or فعدلك in some قراءات, في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك, كلا بل تكذبون بالدين وإن عليكم لحافظين كراما كاتبين. Okay. So, your Lord who has made you, and there is a very interesting discussion about فعدلك or فعدلك, who have made you and apportioned you, and we know that the Quran says that human beings were made in the best form. So that among the things that Allah reminds human beings is that Allah could have created them in whatever form Allah would have willed. في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك. But that Allah created them in a most beautiful, the 2 arms of the same length, 2 legs of the same length, 2 eyes, with and so on and so forth. Now, there is a very interesting debate, and this again all goes under the traditional rubric. Traditional meaning that it is within the mainstream of theological debates. Is human form beautiful? So, is a human form superior to the form of a dog, or a sheep, or a lion, or an elephant? Because God says it is, or is it objectively so? And so, now of course this debate has to do with the nature of beauty. When we talk about, when we talk about what is beautiful and what is not beautiful, there's several possibilities. One possibility is that beauty is simply defined by whatever God says it is. So God says, I've created human beings in a beautiful form because God said it, so that form is beautiful, and that's the beginning and the end. And God says that this form is the most perfect, so it's better than the forms of animals, etc., etc. And so if God would have willed, God could have created us in a less beautiful form. Why? Because God would have called it a less beautiful form. Another possibility is the naturalists who say that no, but they're not pure naturalists, because say this form is beautiful because it resembles the perfected form of the Lord. And this is similar to Christian theology, which the Lord is supposed to have some type of form like human beings. And God creates human beings in God's image, and that's what defines beauty. Others have said, no, it is the laws of physics, and the laws of mathematics that makes the definition of beauty necessary. So bipedal is superior to all fours because of the scientific laws that Allah encoded in creation. And these types of arguments usually say, haven't you noticed that what defines beauty is often apportionment? So it is the mathematical proportions. When a human being, what we call ugly, it is because if you work out the mathematics of this human being, you'll find the mathematics are off. While what is beautiful, if you work out the mathematics, you find the mathematics express proportionality. Now, you might wonder, well, what is the significance of this? Well, the significance of this debate is when Allah says that الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك or عدلك في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك. So some, and I believe this is from al-Maturidi. So he understands this by saying وأنشأه على صورة يعرف المحاسن والمساوئ ويعرف الحكمة والسفه ويميز بينهما ويميز بين المضار والمنافع. So for someone like al-Maturidi and quasi-rationalist or rationalist tafsir, that when Allah says this, Allah doesn't just mean that Allah perfected your physical form, but that Allah gave human beings the ability, natural ability, to distinguish between what is good and what is bad, between what is wise and what is idiotic or safah, just stupidity, and what is harmful and what is beneficial. So that it is all a singular package, and that beauty is as natural, distinguishing beauty and between beauty and its opposite is as natural as distinguishing between what is beneficial and what is harmful, what is wise and what is idiotic, what is beautiful and what is not beautiful. While more literalists or those tafsir that are not oriented towards rationalism or quasi-rationalism would read this as, well, all it means is that if God would have said the form of a donkey is superior to a form of a human being, then a donkey would define beauty and a human being wouldn't. It's basically all goes to what God says. While more sophisticated and layered approaches we find in people like Al-Maturidi and Al-Razi and similar people. And Al-Zamakhshari, of course, in his tafsir. Okay. Okay. كلا بل تكذبون بالدين وإن عليكم لحافظين كراما كاتبين يعلمون ما تفعلون. That Allah alerting human beings that your problem is that you consistently have a hard time coming to terms with the day of accountability or the very logic of accountability. That you think just because you didn't pay the bill or God didn't force you to pay the bill in your earthly life, that somehow it becomes forgotten and or it's swept under the rug. And Allah reminds you that the very logic of for creation to have meaning, which we've encountered before, is that there has to be yawmuddin, there has to be accountability. Now, but Allah reminds us that you are never alone because وَإِنَّ عَلَيْكُمْ لَحَافِظِينَ كِرَامًا كَاتِبِينَ. Now, of course, there's an interesting theological discussion. Does this mean that every human being has a number of angels that accompany this human being everywhere, or is it that just human beings are never out of the gaze and recording activity of angels? The bottom line is that there's always a record being kept. And you are really never alone. So there's a lot of ahadith reported in the context of this ayah that says something to the effect, because there's so many different versions of them, that you are never alone, and so keep that in mind when you change your clothes, when you bathe, and when you go to the bathroom. That some of them, because some in the desert, some people, and this is still, would not cover as they go into the bathroom in the desert, or not cover when they bathe. They just... and in a lot of these ahadith, the Prophet ﷺ adds, so if you don't care about other human beings seeing you, then cover out of respect for the angels that are overlooking or having oversight over you. But there is a genre of hadith that I want to, which says ikrimul kiram al-katibin. That, and I think that's some of the most touching things I've read is the ethics that you could be, how do I put this? That if you have proper manners, you wouldn't want to, even if you have a weak will, you wouldn't want to dishonor the angels that observe you. And that out of sheer out of sheer, what is the word of nobility? Out of sheer nobility is that you would keep in mind that even if my will is weak, I do not want to do what would dishonor, offend the angels that observe over me. And this is translated in some of the writings into some very beautiful literature that about being well-mannered and learning akhlaq, because you're constantly saying, well, you know, if I start raising my voice, for instance, and start yelling and screaming, even if people tolerate me, well, that's not becoming towards the angels that Allah have observing me. Or using foul language, or so some of the most, and of course Sufis are the ones who take this and fly with it, but in the traditional literature you find a lot of writing about ikram al-kiram al-katibin, honoring what Allah calls honorable angels that have oversight over you. Okay. And then the reminder that al-abrar, this is 13. Al-abrar, here it's study Quran translated it as pious, which is fine. Abrar will be in a state of bliss, and that al-fujjar could be kuffar, and it could be people who don't believe in God, or it could be Muslims who are grave sinners or consistent sinners, will be in damnation. Okay. إن الفجار في جحيم يصلونها يوم الدين وما هم عنها بغائبين وما أدراك ما يوم الدين ثم ما أدراك يوم الدين. The only issue that comes up here in traditional tafsir is وما هم عنها بغائبين. This is number 16. That they will not be absent from it. And this figures into the debate among Muslim theologians as to whether hellfire is permanent or not permanent. And as we'll leave this to another context, but it is a roughly, there are two schools of thought. One that, at least for Muslims, that they're in hellfire until they settle their accounts. And then the other schools of thought, because it included the Mu'tazila, for instance, that said that no, hellfire is a permanent state of damnation. يوم لا تملك نفس لنفس شيئا والأمر يومئذ لله. So, and finally, a day will accountability is personal and direct. No soul will avail another. And again, an indication of an early Meccan surah, because by now we all know that among the principles that Islam affirms very strongly from the very beginning is the idea of personal accountability. No parents, no priests, no rulers. The idea that your accountability can be mitigated because you are following a superior or a tradition or a mythology or whatever, is something that in Islam is rejected outright, and that accountability is direct and personal, and that each person will have to answer for their decisions as their decisions. Okay. So this is basically the traditional approach, which, as you see, I mean, it's fairly direct. There are certain issues that arise in Islamic theology, not exclusively. The locus for these debates is not Surah Al-Infitar exclusively, but the types of issues that are raised by Surah Al-Infitar, like the permanence of hellfire or the non-permanence of hellfire and so on. Now, of course, it would not surprise you that the Sufi-esque tafsir stick to their methodology of understanding much of the language metaphorically. But interestingly, most of the Sufi-esque tafsir still understood Surah Al-Infitar as speaking about the point of the liberation of the soul from its animalistic attributes or its animalistic qualities. So they, in a lot of, so إذا انفطرت سماء الروح الحيوانية بانفراجها عن الروح الإنساني وزوالها, that when the time comes that the animalistic soul is separated from the humanistic soul. And what they mean by this is the soul in its true unadulterated form, when it's able to get rid of its base elements. And for those who have thought enlightenment and achieved the level of enlightenment. And so وإذا الكواكب انتصرت أي الحواس انتشرت بالموت وذهبت حواس البشر and so on and so forth, موت الطبيعة وموت إرادي and so on. So that the point where your senses have become, so the planets, when God says that the planets are, or stars are dispersed, in a lot of the Sufiyist tafsir, they read this to mean that the day when the senses are dispersed, so the senses are extinguished. So they're often talking about the day, the understand this not so much as a description of the final day, but a description of death. And it is the point where you get rid of your physical senses, and as you get rid of your physical senses, you also get rid of, or the true form of your soul emerges, and in that true form of the soul, the barzakh, or what separates realms of reality or different dimensions, starts dissolving so that you can perceive truth. And the closer you are to Allah, the more your perception of truth will be enlightened and illuminated. And then Sufis like Ibn Arabi and Qushayri say that that day of death can either be voluntary or involuntary. So maut tabi'i or maut iradi, it could be the day of your natural death, or it could be the day of your rebirth. So the day that you are able to liberate yourself of your dependence on your natural senses, so much so that you are no longer bound by the physical reality and you can see beyond it because of the path that you've walked, the Sufi path that you've walked. And that so we are forced into perceiving something beyond our material reality in our natural death. But for those on the Sufi path, they can, if they achieve illumination, they can see beyond the physical reality before the day of their natural death. Okay, and in the Sufi-esque approach then, when there is a lot written on that illumination, that if you are on the path of illumination and you actually achieve the voluntary death and rebirth, that Kiram Katibin, they no longer become in the world of ghaib, but you actually either perceive them or you feel them as a certain reality. And in that state, you are always aware of the angels that have the duty of oversight and keeping a record. And you can never be oblivious. You can never ignore them, you can never be oblivious to them, and you care more about honoring them and being polite. I mean, they actually speak in terms of language of being polite to them. Like, for instance, always say Salam Alaikum when you wake up, always say Salam Alaikum before you go to sleep. So they become very much a part of your reality in every sense. Of course, and then the day of accountability is, you go beyond the perception of it as accountability, but you actually look for that day because it's the day of elevation and the day of the removal of the hujub, the day of the removal of the veils. And that's the gist of what you can describe as the Sufi-esque approaches to Surah Al-Infitar, is that it's not that, like a Jirani, for instance, he goes through the traditional tafsir, gives you the straightforward, traditional meaning, and then after doing so, then he talks about what Surah Al-Infitar means for the person on the Sufi path. Okay. Now, and Allahu A'lam, Allah knows best. But what strikes me about Surah Al-Infitar, you know what? This is the last part where I talk about my approach. So let's take let's pray Maghrib. We're going to pray Maghrib, inshallah, and come back. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay. So first, let me say that I accept the traditional tafsir as precisely on point. إذا السماء انفطرت وإذا الكواكب انتثرت and وإذا البحار فجرت, that clearly Allah is describing an event that is culminated with the expression وَإِذَا الْقُبُورُ بُعْثِرَتْ, that if the graves are turned upside down. But there, as those who've been following me know, that there are layers of meaning that could be simultaneously valid at the same time. And I do agree with the Sufi approach that often reads references to the sama as references to the ruh, to the soul. So typically in Sufi tafsir, they will say إذا انفطرت سماء الروح, that if the sama, إذا انفطرت سماء الروح, how to translate this? No, literally it would be if the heavens of the soul is split asunder, but sama al-ruh means if the very essence of the inner soul of a human being is split asunder. So that and if read that way, so when Allah describes these events, إذا السماء انفطرت وإذا الكواكب انتثرت وإذا البحار فجرت وإذا القبور بعثرت, there are events in human life. These could be physical events taking place around us, where we see the atmosphere of the earth being destroyed and the oceans being ruined, whether they are flooding or whether they're drying, and so on and so forth. But if these are understood metaphorically, then follow the logic of these expressions. So, sama, the very sphere of where the self dwells, if it is ripped asunder, and kawakib in Sufi metaphor, kawakib often stands for what a person knows, or the knowledge base, or the epistemology of a human being, what the package of what a person knows. So if your very essence meets that point where it is ripped asunder, where you feel that you are at a point where what defines, however you define yourself, what defines you as a self, is ripped asunder. And what you believe you know and what you thought you knew is as if Infitar being dispersed, but in a literal way, but Infitar could also be something that is just violently cast away. وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ فُجِّرَتْ. And bihar in Sufi metaphors is often the basis of wisdom and basis of what a person, it's a deeper knowledge of the self as opposed to the simple constructs from which a person derives superficial meaning. So وَإِذَا الْبِحَارُ فُجِّرَتْ, and at that point deeper questions about the essence of things are literally as if exploding before you. So you ask, to put quite simply, what you base yourself on has been ripped asunder. What you thought you know is challenged and seems to be shaken. And these deeper, if you will, existential questions are now exploding before your eyes, literally meaning that they are emerging like volcanic eruptions. This is the point. Qubur Bu'thirat in Sufi literature is often metaphor for a point of rebirth. And I agree with that metaphoric understanding of things. But here, in my view, Qubur Bu'thirat this is the point where the possibility of rebirth becomes real. But rebirth doesn't always, in Sufi approaches, rebirth is always a point of enlightenment. In my view, rebirth here doesn't necessarily mean enlightenment, but a chance of enlightenment, an opportunity of enlightenment. But it depends on precisely how you respond to the other two elements. علمت نفس ما قدمت وأخرت. This is the point that a human being confronts their legacy, what they put forward and what they've done in the past, what they done for their future, and what they've done with the life they've lived, their past legacy, whatever it is. If you confront it with true ilm, in other words, you confront it honestly and truthfully, the result of that rebirth will be one thing. If you fail to confront it honestly and truthfully, the result will be entirely different. But it all depends on the next issue. ما غرك بربك الكريم. Why, as you confront your past and you confront what is ahead of you, what were the reasons? What issues stand between you and embracing your Lord? Because gharrak literally means one of the clear literal meanings of it is, why have you been missing your Lord? Why have you not been finding your Lord? That's the critical question. Because whether you are going to be among the abrar fi na'im or fujjar fi jahim, whether you're going to be a state of bliss or the opposite of bliss, it all depends on whether your introspection and retrospection about what you've done with your life is going to lead you to understand what things make you take God for granted, what things make you project yourself unto God, what things stand between you and feeling God in your heart as your true companion. Sure, you have kiram katibin ya'lamuna ma taf'alun, but can you imagine someone that says, I will be a person of proper manners towards the angels that have oversight over me, without that affecting the relationship with the Lord? I mean, a priori, the question is not whether you are aware of the oversight of the angels, but the question is whether you are aware of the oversight of the Lord of the angels. If Allah tells you that you are in the sight of angels, that begs the question again, well, why have you been off the path with your Lord? Now, these points of existential crisis, they are a gift and a challenge. They are a real test in the life of every human being. All of us, at one point or another, whether because of a calamity, you lose a loved one, or a personal challenge, you become ill, you have an accident, may God forbid, and you get seriously injured, whatever it is in your life, you will come to that point, always. And where that door opens, it's as if your sky has been ripped asunder, your kawakib intatharat, what you thought you knew has been blown apart. Your bihar fujirat, you are asking these deeper questions about everything. But it all depends on how you reflect upon your legacy backwards and forwards, and how that reflection on the legacy translates into that basic question, ما غرك بربك الكريم. This is Rabb Kareem, noble and generous. Kareem also means kind and tolerant. Well, if your Lord has been tolerant towards you, patient towards you, have not made you suffer the consequences of your misdeeds, has covered for you. You've committed things that could have been horrific, but your Lord concealed these things and gave you a chance. There are many points in life where you could have gone completely off track, and your Lord consistently didn't make the worst possible scenario materialize. ما غرك بربك الكريم. Then why do you keep not finding your Lord? This test then can become your liberation, or you become your curse. And it then defines whether you become among the abrar fi na'im or al-fujjar fi jahim. Because it ultimately will define whether you become among the abrar or among fujjar. And ultimately your fate in Yawmuddin, the day where the accounts are settled. And the closing of Surah Al-Infitar alerts you to one of the basic elements of any thorough deep self-reflection. Blaming the circumstance, blaming your parents, blaming this influence or these circumstances or this or that is not going to work. As Allah says, يوم لا تملك نفس لنفس شيئا. It is, the accountability is direct and personal. And so part of this process of answering the question, ما غرك بربك الكريم, is to in fact be able to confront this individual accountability and I don't know of a single time where anyone has received illumination in the path of the Lord on earth where a person continued to blame circumstance or blame other human beings. In other words, I don't know of a single example where a person continued to be delusional about their personal responsibility for whatever happened, whatever they've done, where they've actually made any progress. A requirement of progress is that you are able to take personal accountability, full responsibility for what you've done in the past and what you've prepared for the future. This is an Allahu A'lam, that only Allah knows best, is what my ta'abbud on Surah Al-Infitar, what has always filled my heart about Surah Al-Infitar. That yes, it's warning us about the hereafter, but it's also alerting us about these fundamental questions about whether we are going to be able to find our path with God on this earth in response to the tests and simultaneously the opportunities, because every test is an opportunity that Allah presents us with. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. God knows best. Alhamdulillah. Okay, we're done with Surah Al-Infitar.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. You know, it's even though this surah was so short, it's so profound, and I think that your take on it, as I mentioned, is extremely meaningful for me, because I know that, and I think I would just share this for anyone who is interested in this I guess journey from the beginning to the end. I mean, one of the things that I always felt so blessed to have, I mean, it's like, when you marry a sheikh, you get all kinds of great benefits, right? So I mean, it's like you get to understand Islam in a way that most people don't. You get to get exposed to a lot of different understandings, knowledge, and all of that, but also the personal example. And then in my own case, I was so fortunate because certainly I had so much personal growth that had to happen, and a lot of healing from previous traumatic events. And when I hear this approach in this surah, it's so much of what Sheikh took me through in terms of learning how to really honestly confront myself and my own accountability in things, because especially if you are a victim of trauma or have gone through difficult experiences, it's very easy to be used to being in the mindset of a victim, and what that does is it makes it very convenient to sort of deny your own accountability in situations, and it's a wonderful crutch to hold you back from exactly this, from moving forward in your life in so many different ways, in getting closer to God, in the sense that there's always this barrier of something you are not being honest with yourself about. And being honest with yourself is probably one of the most painful exercises, and it's difficult to do by yourself. In fact, impossible, I think. And we've talked about in the past here, it seems that a very close, I guess, example of what Sheikh took me through is oftentimes modeled in some of these anonymous groups, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. There are the 12 steps, and it's something that people either in trauma or outside of trauma actually even participate in, people who have family members who are dealing with addiction or issues like that. But the whole process of really confronting yourself and being honest with yourself is very fearful, right? And so fear is often what I think holds people back from elevating. And if you have the strength, you have the opportunity to work through like understanding your own, like what you did in the past, what you're, like as it says in the Surah, thinking about your legacy, thinking about the things that are holding you back from reaching out to God. And you can actually confront yourself and own up to those things. It is so liberating because you are facing fear in the face and just saying, no, I'm going to own this. I did this. I'm capable of this. And because I'm aware and being honest and transparent, I can move forward beyond the fear. And there's so much to be said about it, but I don't know if this is, not very transparent, but it's just from my own experience. The more honest and transparent you are with yourself, the more able you are to, be honest before God. And obviously, it's better to do it now before you reach the final day. So, anyway.
When I read the books, read the book, the Alcoholics Anonymous, or use what is the expression, fearless moral inventory. Fearless moral inventory. And I was struck, the guy who wrote this book, or who invented this method, must have studied Islam. It just, the coincidences or the similarities are just uncanny. So I'm completely convinced he must have been exposed to Islamic theology somehow.
Well, I heard that it was actually taken by a group called the Oxford Group, which then took it from Islam and kind of turned it towards their own.
Well, the Oxford
purposes.
Group was obsessed with Islamic culture.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if it originated from the Oxford Group, they were obsessed with everything Islamic, because it was after the Protestant Reformation, and they were, anyway. But the idea of fearless moral inventory and fearless moral inventory is precisely what is needed as an antidote to al-ghurur billah, because that very even that expression, the Quranic expression, غرك بالله الغرور, that the ego deludes a human being to the point that a human being literally cannot find the Lord, cannot find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, cannot find means cannot find a relationship, cannot find a meaningful relationship. And it is transparency, the only thing that will enable a person to find a meaningful relationship. But as long as a human being hides in the mythology of circumstance and, well, my circumstance, my situation, just things happen, it will never be. It will never be.
So my point about bringing up the 12 steps is that, I was so fortunate to go through the Islamic, training that the Sheikh put me through to help me grow. But obviously this really doesn't exist anywhere. And it's something, that is really inaccessible. And the closest thing that that I could find that is similar to what I went through is the 12 steps. And in fact, it seemed like it was even more intense in some ways. So for people who are looking for an actual like structured way of working through that, I would highly recommend checking that out, because in the absence of, unfortunately, not having these kinds of institutions where, or sheikhs or, that whole system that we can draw upon, the closest thing in our world now is the 12 steps, which I think has also been extremely effective. Although, obviously it's not Islamic per se, but it still takes you through a difficult set of exercises that are extremely valuable. So anyway, on that note, Cheyenne, do you want to start us out? Okay. Oh, and the whole thing is the dhikr, right? There's no, okay.
Thank you, Sheikh. When you speak about blaming circumstances or finding ways to say your circumstances is exceptional, it reminds me of some of your older lectures where you mentioned halat al-istisna, and that being the types of those being the most dangerous in terms of, well, perhaps essentially leading towards, darkness. And you were mentioning it more in the capacity of in a marriage, but it seemed that generally you were referencing that these types of exceptional circumstances tend to come up with people that you're closer to. It's easy to be generally kind and generous to neighbors and people that you come into contact with on a less frequent basis. But for those that are closer to you, these exceptional circumstances tend to allow you to fall short or to, as you've said also before, get tired of doing things the right way. Do you have any kind of just general thoughts about how to be very careful about these exceptional circumstances, such that it would be nice if I could see an angel above me at all times, because it would be a reminder, but it seems that you don't really get to see that or feel that until you've figured out how to overcome those exceptional circumstances.
Yeah, first, what Shayan is referring to is that I think in older lectures, I was talking about the fact that human beings have, they don't have just one personality, they have multiple personalities, and these multiple personalities are often situational. That there's a personality that they put on, let's say, for example, at work, and there's a personality that they may put on with neighbors, and there's a personality that they put on with a group of friends, and then there's a personality that they might put on for passerbys, people that they just come into passing engagement with. And the hardest of them all is the personality that they put on with those closest to them, because this actually is the one that comes closest to what their true core is. And the reason, quite simply, is that with those that you are familiar with, you tire of putting on, you get tired and you get forgetful, both, of putting on an act, a performance. And often the tendency is to do with people close to you what people often do with God. and that is to take for those who are close to you for granted, and to simply assume, well, if I'm not doing things properly, or then they should just forgive me. You know, they know who I am, they know what my intentions are. I'm a wonderful human being, so they should just overlook this, overlook whatever you want them to overlook. That's the istisna that Shayan was talking about, the exceptionalism. And this is a real problem. The person who is truly balanced, who has gone through the journey of introspection, their inside is like their outside. The multiple personalities coalesce around the core that shines through, and that shines through so strongly that it sort of casts a light upon all the other situational personalities. So yeah, of course, you might have a certain way of talking and acting at work, but if your core is solid, none of these situations at work will be inconsistent with the core. Where it is inconsistent with the core is when the core is so weak that it basically equals all the other situational personalities. So, you could be pleasant and humorous at work, and then you go home and you're grouchy and in a bad mood. That's that's sort of the typical thing that you see. And subhanAllah, that in Surah Al-Infitar, and Shayan sort of alluded to this, that in Surah Al-Infitar it reminds you that you have kiraman katibin يعلمون ما تفعلون, that you actually, one way of trying to get to the core is to keep in mind that in or out, whether you are at home with close people or you are in different situations, it is the same observers that are recording you. And often, when I was younger, I would play this, I don't know, I would wonder what the angels thought of me. So I would often try to internalize the angels' view of me and see if they would be, thoroughly disappointed, think of me as a hypocrite, think I don't know if that would work for everyone, but that's what I used to do. And of course, when it was helpful. I mean, because it's a way of trying to hold a mirror to yourself. But there is no magical way. The reason we say علمت نفس ما قدمت وأخرت, and the whole idea of the fearless moral inventory, I like this language because it is often requires a degree of fearlessness, and that you just remember that the Prophet ﷺ reminds us that the best of us are the best of us in ethical character, and ethical character, you begin judging the ethical character from how you are to those closest to you. So, and that is examining your behavior by saying, how am I towards those I'm most likely to take for granted? And examining your behavior from that outwards, the simple fact that you confront yourself, that you take those closest to you for granted is a step forward, because the same personality traits that makes you take other human beings for granted, which is a form of narcissism, is what makes you take God for granted. That you simply forgive yourself, you indulge yourself. And what is it that Allah reminds us all the time is that forgiveness should come from Allah, not from self-indulgence. It is not up to you to say, I forgive myself, before coming to terms with whether Allah forgives you or not. And the same with those who are closest to you. The confronting the narcissistic ego that simply says, well, as long as I can hide it from the public, then it's okay. It's, you have to confront the truth of that. You're a liar and you're a cheat. If you rely on maintaining your respect by hiding something from the public, then there's a deep dishonesty in you. Precisely, you're a kadhib, you're a liar. And that's, as harsh as it is, but that's the beginning of the path to cleansing yourself. All of us are prone to not just dualities, but being multiple people at the same time. We play roles all the time. But unlike in a lot of secular thought, the Islamic path is to believe in a true core, and to hold tenaciously to the idea of transparency and truth as a path to liberation. And the most liberating truth of all is self-confrontation, to confront yourself before others confront you, before God confronts you, before the angels confront you.
Can I add something too?
Jordan.
Because I think also in the sometimes in if you've experienced like trauma, and the whole idea of like even becoming like a chameleon, where you have these situational personalities, but sometimes because you've learned that you have to survive by having a certain persona in certain situations and in others, it's also easy to have so many situational personalities that you actually don't know who you are and you don't know what your core is. And so that is even more reason. I don't know that it's just that you're a liar, because in those situations, I mean, you are a liar, but it may be just because you really had to learn through survival to, subsume your personality or your core to whoever was your abuser. So part of reclaiming yourself is working through all of those kinds of things. So, you know, like for me, one of the most liberating things was to finally feel like I had a right to a core and determine what that is. And then once I figured out what my core was, then it's like, okay, now I can actually own it and be myself instead of be whoever I am dependent on who's around me. And that is ultimately liberating because then you know who you are and you're not scared.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway. Any more questions?
Thank you, Sheikh, for presenting this surah. I think as you share your knowledge, we are given responsibility more responsibility to continue to apply the knowledge and be moral beings. My question to you is regarding our responsibility to guide others and kind of whether we have that responsibility and how it needs to be applied. I think recently, you know, I've come across a situation where I've seen a dear friend who's been struck from one calamity to the other, one ill parent to another ill parent, and multiple other kind of sad life events in the in-between. And with that, there's been a small admission that the Islam and the Muslim that she was is sort of starting to disintegrate. Yet is looking for maybe solutions of trying to seek out a sheikh who can maybe read Quran and make some of these, you know, tragic life events that have been unfolding maybe stop unfolding, but is not necessarily looking for ways of rooting herself back in her faith. And so I've been personally very apprehensive to provide any guidance because I think that requires a lot of thought and education and just tact in how you approach another individual. And I'm afraid of perhaps not being able to deliver the message properly. And so I guess my question to you is, do I have a responsibility to feel that I need to intervene because of that admission that maybe she's not, that she's kind of falling away from her faith?
You know, I don't want to deal with the issue from the point of view of whether you have a duty to intervene, but rather what is the beautiful thing to do, because you know, at what point we have a duty to intervene, it gets too complicated. It gets into legalities, and this is not a situation where the legality gives us the satisfying answer. I mean, it's not a question of what's your amount of your knowledge compared to the complexity of the situation, and you know, these questions ultimately. But if you see a friend that can definitely benefit from guidance, and that friend is responding to calamities by having a crisis, effectively. I think that the best thing to do is to try to suggest to this friend to talk to people that you trust, that could possibly have the Islamic knowledge that could provide guidance. To not do anything, not even suggest that they talk to someone is problematic from a moral perspective. I mean, I don't know whether you incur sin or not, because that just depends on so many factors. But from a moral perspective, from the point of view of ihsan, of what's hasan. But I would not, I mean, of course, I don't know who this friend is, I don't know the circumstances of that friend, but it's not, the point is not lecturing to this friend or jumping in with, advice as to, but whether it is possible to recommend, to urge them to talk to someone. Because if they're saying they're reading Quran to prevent the calamities from occurring, that seems to be not the right approach. I mean, this sort of believing that if bringing someone to recite Quran, that's going to fix anything, just because of the blessings of the Quran, that seems, then it's no wonder that you would end up with a crisis of faith, because you seem to think of God in a rather didactic fashion. Put in the coin, you get solutions. And so why is it that I'm putting in the coins and I'm not getting solutions? And that could be possibly the problem, and it seems then they need they need to want advice. That's one, but all you can do is to recommend to them, talk to this person or read this material. I think that would be what I would feel duty bound to do if I was in your situation.
Do you have a question?
Thank you so much. This is a really kind of straightforward question. If I'm honest, it's probably I'm thinking more of transcriptions. I've got the transcription hat on for the tafsir. Could you comment on the relationship between Infitar and Takwir, because they seem to be so stylistically very, very similar. علمت نفس ما أحضرت وقدمت وأخرت. But also because we've had the halaqas of both of them now, the themes covered seem to be very, particularly your own personal approach, very, very similar. I think Takwir is a bit more detailed. Takwir talks about the Prophet, but I'm also just thinking this now, because we covered in that Takwir was a very early revelation, I think 6th or 7th. So if there is an umbilical relationship, would that not further strengthen the argument that Infitar is a very early Meccan surah as well?
Yeah, the Takwir, and the question is, what is the relationship between Surah Al-Takwir, which is very early, and Surah Al-Infitar, because both of them, and even even the hadith of the Prophet, which talks about the blessings of reading Surah Al-Takwir and Surah Al-Infitar, which is interesting because it mentions these two, which have so many similarities and have that same theme about reflecting upon what you've done in the past, and where the trajectory of your actions are going to take you. or differently, what the example you've created in life is going to be taken into forward looking. So yes, and that is another reason that I believe that Surah Al-Infitar is an early Meccan revelation. It has a similar message to Surah Al-Takwir, but Surah Al-Takwir, as you pointed out, it has, in more detail, it addresses the Prophet, the particular things about the Prophet, or addresses itself to the Prophet at several points. Now, but Surah Al-Infitar has particularly that what becomes a consistent Quranic theme in later revelations. Al-Ghurur Billah, Ma Gharraka bi Rabbika al-Kareem. And at the most basic level, if you just take the most basic idea of Al-Ghurur Billah, is what makes you think that, what is it in you that makes you think that God is just going to, because you are the wonderful person that you think you are, you know, that narcissism and egocentrism that makes human beings think, well, it's not possible that God would torture me. I mean, God will torture other people, but not me. Which is at the heart of so many. I mean, if people are honest with themselves, they will confront themselves that that's precisely what occurs to them. Oh, there's so many people worse than I am, so, you know, they'll go first, but it will never get to me. And obviously, that's precisely that's precisely the moral malady with so much immorality, exceptionalism. So much immorality starts with exceptionalism, with a human being thinking whatever Allah says to others, well, it's not going to apply to me. And I dare say that the vast majority of what people who say they believe in God or believe in Islam do wrong is due to this exceptionalism in one form or another. In fact, one of the things that really has struck me in law is I've met people who've done horrible things. I mean, and not Muslim, but people, but also Muslim. I mean, I've seen people who've mistreated their wives horribly, or, you know, they come to their wife after 40 years of marriage, and then they dump their wife or something. And none of them believe that they're bad human beings. It's exceptionalism, the logic of exceptionalism. They're always, somehow they think that, no, I'm not a bad human being. Other people who've done that, they might themselves have even criticized others who've done the same thing. But it's the logic of exceptionalism that somehow it just doesn't, the same doesn't apply to me because there's something special. But the other thing that also striking is that in legal practice, when dealing with just, I rarely met people who've done things like sexual abuse, molestations. None of them believe that they're bad human beings. They all function with the logic of exceptionalism. You know, other people, they have, but I just have, there's something, I don't know, whatever they believe is, and it's not logical, it's an attitude, but if the reason it doesn't come out to the open is because it's illogical. Whoever embraces it can't defend it. So it's often just an attitude and so on. So at the most basic level is to confront human beings with that logic of exceptionalism. ما غرك بربك الكريم. But then beyond that is to tie the ghurur billah into this whole element of egocentrism and narcissistic traits. Because even those who often say they don't believe in God, this is my own observation, and Allahu Alam, and Allah knows best. But I often find that they're often disappointed in the morality of others, like people that say that they're Muslim and they're disappointed in their morality, but they rarely confront themselves about the ways that their own morality is deficient. And it is that air of exceptionalism and air of narcissism that allows them to then become dismissive of God. There's sort of an air of so this is the main, I see this as the main, when I focus on Infitar, yes, Infitar has some of the same processes of calling, of using terminology of nature to refer to a process of turmoil and confrontation. But when the thing that grabs your attention in Surah Al-Infitar is precisely this ayah, مَا غَرَّكَ بِرَبِّكَ الْكَرِيمِ. And then when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, في أي سورة ما شاء ركبك الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك في أي سورة ما شاء ركبك. I agree that the tarkib here is not a reference to simply your physical attributes, but that the tarkib is Allah saying what Allah has said in the Quran repeatedly, that remember that if Allah would have willed, your knowledge of whatever intuitive sense of right and wrong you have, whatever this fitrah that allows you to differentiate between what is ugly and what is not ugly, between what is harmful, what is not harmful, that yes, it is, Allah has the power to alter your psychology in whatever Allah wills. Now, in this, both is a criticism but hope, in that you can't say, there is no way around having to confront yourself and to confront your responsibility for the way your psychology is, but to also know that if you hold steadfast to you, Allah, then Allah will help to change your psychology. A lot of people who've been raised in an egocentric way, or have never really been there are a lot of people who just, the way they're raised is that right and wrong doesn't have to do with principles, it has to do with the pleasure of the mother or father. You know, it's, well, why do I do this? Because I said so. Not because of anything. So a lot of the people, as they're growing, they can't believe that there is something that can modify, change their psychology from its absolute reliance on egocentrism, because whether it's their ego or the ego of their parents, it's the same thing. But once they start developing a relationship with Allah, it becomes clear to them that their psychology can in fact be modified and changed. They can go from someone who can easily lose their temper to someone who's very calm. They can go from someone who is insensitive to someone who constantly thinks of the feelings of others. This type of drastic psychological change is something within, you have to believe that this is within Allah's ability. And that's how I understand that الذي خلقك فسواك فعدلك في أي صورة ما شاء ركبك, that Allah can put the building blocks as Allah wills. And that's another thing in Surah Al-Infitar. Well, so many questions from the internal group.
I know.
I didn't imagine Surah Al-Infitar would raise all these questions. Hold on.
This halakha in Surah, I've thought about Teta a lot because she was somebody who, in the face of her own calamity, the way that she handled her own calamity was very graceful and very patient and without any complaining. But I feel like her level of accountability was not just of taking personal accountability, was so much so that when she saw me going through my own calamity, she never came and tried to correct me. She never came and tried to preach to me. She very rarely tried to school anybody or tell them what the correct way is. She was just very patiently and very quietly an example of what the correct way to live is. And if there was anyone who I feel like has, as an example in my life of someone who had the right to go around and to preach to people what the correct thing to do is, I feel like it was her. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this aspect of personal accountability, that it's not just, because it's very easy to see the surface level that it's about the things that I do wrong. But let's say that I've now set off on the journey and I found some sort of connection with Allah and I'm feeling tempted to go and start correcting everyone. And it comes from a good place. It's like I found something and I want other people to find it too. And I get very excited about that. But do you think that in that is a level of externalizing accountability? Of now, it's almost like a trap. It's like I start paying attention to more how other people should be held accountable or what other people should be doing, rather than continuing to only look at myself. And I guess another way of wording this question is, do you think that it's necessary for me to find, or for anybody to find God before helping others to find God? And at what point is that not as relevant anymore?
I mean, it's not all or nothing, because I mean it is, if there are situations where if you can be of service to someone who doesn't have as much knowledge as you, as much faith as you. Be of service meaning directing them towards or suggesting something to them, or it's something good and something that counts for you. But what Sharif was referring to is my mother, which is he's right. I mean, my mother, especially actually, I mean, I don't actually remember her ever, even in her younger years, being very preachy. She didn't lecture much, and she did lead by example. And but she, at the same time, because she was so introspective and so her path with her relationship with Allah was intimate and personal and extensive, and it would come out just in her regular expressions that were not intended as lessons or any. But she had the ability to comment in very brief ways when she would see something wrong in just a few words. So with her children, for instance, if she saw something that she didn't approve of, I mean, she would say something as brief as, what are you going to tell Allah? And that would be it. No long lecture, it's just a brief statement. And in fact, that brief statement was often far more powerful and far more biting than any lecture. It's often, even if you pretend to ignore the few words when you hear them, they stay with you, because when the fewer the words, the less your ego is able to rush to your defense and construct barriers and so on. But so the Prophet ﷺ, puts it succinctly that truly fortunate is a person who's preoccupied with their own faults than the faults of others. And if you focus on your own faults, it will keep you very busy, because all of us as human beings, our own faults can, and it is often our ability to become addicted to talk and to long speeches and words is what camouflages our inability to confront ourselves. So with someone who goes off avoiding their own faults by turning the scope onto others is obviously in deep trouble. It's easy to turn the gaze onto others and to notice what everyone else does that's wrong. That's precisely what breeds hypocrisy. But that doesn't mean that, a person can't help or be of assistance to others at certain points, under certain circumstances, unless they perfect their relationship with God. That doesn't follow either. I mean, you can still be of guidance to others or help at least others. But absolutely the moral imperative is to preoccupy yourself with your own relationship with Allah. And you cannot turn the gaze onto others. The gaze must be always directed at the self, and let others come to you and force you to gaze upon them. I mean, that's another thing that about my mother and people like my mother, is I don't remember a single time that she has volunteered to go up to someone and tell them any of, even when at times I knew that she did not agree with. So she would be invited to dinners, and she wouldn't approve of how much food is wasted and how much food people are gorging themselves on. She wouldn't say anything, but those who knew her knew that she didn't approve, and she wouldn't accept the dinner invitation from the same people again. That's the way she worked. She was a muhajjaba herself, but I don't ever remember her saying anything to anyone about. I know that sometimes she would see someone and disapprove of their immodesty, but it would take a lot. I mean, and most of the time, it's only when people would go to her and ask her, "What do you think of what I'm wearing?" And then she would be honest. I mean, she was often brutally honest. She would just simply say, "I don't think it's modest." But that's because the only time she would really volunteer to say anything is when, because the ego had been disciplined. So it's only when it's truly out of love for the other person, not out of a desire to stroke her ego. And most of the time, I don't think she I mean, and I think that's because I know that she would notice things, but she was known in the family for her silence. She valued silence. But remarkably, those of us who knew her well knew what and actually quite often a look of disapproval without saying any word, anything, was the worst thing that, as her children, the worst thing that would befall us is if she looks at you disapprovingly without saying anything and without even meaning to shame you or anything like that. But that's just such a level of piety that we all aspire for.
Okay, well, we're really running out of time, but there are still a few good questions. Maybe I can read all of them, and you can try and do a really
pick one,
brief, or do a brief one, or see if you want to hold off on until the next one. So, okay. This is from Huda. Assalamu alaikum. The 12-step program was mentioned, and I understand they do a thorough life inventory and then a daily inventory for maintenance, and they have a specific list of things to reflect on each day. But do Sufis offer us with a specific inventory as they do? And what is your suggestion on how to do inventory, or how does one maintain that light after rebirth? That's one. Second question, Assalamu alaikum. If the goal is to combine your inner and outer selves as much as possible, such that there is a true core self, is it better for you to be transparent about the flaws of your core self, or is it better to hide your flaws until you have resolved them? If the former, what is the best way to communicate your flaws? And then the last question is actually, I want to put it out there because it's from a convert. In the circumstance of being a convert, or he says revert, who has not yet come out about being a Muslim, living with a family that aren't accustomed to Islam, how does one make up for not being able to pray 5 times a day on time and without being disturbed or so cautious about members of family walking in and asking questions?
Wow. Okay, so very quickly, yes, there are the moral inventory with your shuyukh, with a sheikh. Normally, they will give you instructions on how to go about doing the equivalent of the moral inventory. The difference is a lot of shuyukh do not want to hear you admit to them, but will give you instructions on how to admit it to yourself. Some shuyukh will actually have you write the inventory. My method is to actually have you write everything, and a thorough list, and a list upon list. And I've learned that from some of my teachers. So it depends, it varies very widely by the sheikh you're with and what they believe. Some shuyukh just don't want to see confessions or what they associate with confessions. And they just want you to confess everything between you and God on your own. My method is not so much that I want to see the confessions, but I believe that there must be the concrete step of pinning them down. So, because otherwise, there is no way I can provide feedback on what a person is doing. Okay. The second question, interestingly, is sort of related a bit to the first, in that it is the point is not to go confessing your faults to people. If you are going to be confessing your faults to anyone, it's confessing them to yourself before God, or your sheikh, someone who's actually guiding you through this process. But self-flagellation, where you go around basically telling people, here are my faults, no, I don't recommend that at all. Not out of arrogance, but because a lot of times that gives a false sense of humility, and a lot of times the sort of let me confess my faults to you becomes an addiction in itself, and it gives a false sense of righteousness and goodness. Just because you told, for instance, just because you told your mother, yes, I admit that I raise my voice to you all the time. Doesn't get you off the hook. So what? You've admitted it. It has to change. And so a lot of people, and I've seen that especially with wives and husbands, you know, they'll use confessionals as a way of basically evading responsibility. Yeah, you know, I do admit I take you for granted and I'm sorry for that. And then they continue doing it. The third one is hard. That one, because it requires that we talk about the specific circumstances of who you're with and what it would mean for these people to see you praying and for you to communicate, this is something I'm doing for myself, I'm on my own journey, I'm not ready to ask questions, and when I'm ready, I will let you know. But and to secure that type of privacy, because that type of privacy is important. And for you not to be placed in a situation where when you pray, you are worried about who's watching you and who's seeing you and so on, especially when prayer at this very early stage is a really an intense emotional experience. Having eyes upon you is not always healthy unless you can make sure that you can communicate to people that I don't want you to focus your attention on what I'm doing. That you know, I need boundaries and I need space. If this is something that is a serious issue, maybe you should talk to me separately, because this might be a bit of a complicated situation.
Okay, so for that third question, I think it came in through YouTube. So if you want to email the professor, you can.
We could email you and
Or
then
email
you can
me,
let me
actually.
know.
Okay, Sharif will put it on the YouTube. So.
Yeah.
Okay, and on that note, thank you everyone for being with us for another wonderful session, and we look forward to getting together again this coming Saturday, inshallah. So I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the week, and alhamdulillah, thank you so much for this incredible learning experience as always. We're so blessed and burdened also. Alhamdulillah. So it's all wonderful. Okay. Wonderful to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.